Okay, now we're going to look at example 2B. This is on page 96 and 97. And it's basically the same scenario as example 2A, but they're adding an additional fact to it. And the additional fact is to assume that the well was drilled this time on D's lease. So just remind you of the facts of 2A. We're in a simple scenario where A, B, C, and D each own a lease covering a quarter section in section 1. They each own a 160-acre lease. A's lease was taken from the mineral owner for a 1/8 royalty. B's is a 3/16 royalty payable to the mineral owner. C is a 1/4 royalty, and D is a 3/16 royalty. So what they want to do is they want to drill these wells together. So they enter into a joint operating agreement, and the contract area is defined as section 1. And 1/8 is inserted in Article 3B. Now they're adding a new fact to us. It's not a gas unit. It's still a 160 space oil well, but instead of being drilled on C's lease, now it's going to be drilled on D's lease. So D's lease is the 3/16 royalty. This is going to be a 160-acre gas unit. So now we're going to assume the well was drilled on D's lease. So here's that oil and gas well. So let's look at the problems then. Again, these are the same questions that they're asking in example 1 and example 2A. And the first part is the working interest. The working interest is, just like in example 1 and example 2A, they each own a 160 acres, and the entire joint operating agreement is all of section 1, which is 640 acres. So that means their working interest is going to be 25%, or 1/4 each. So we'll write that in the blank. Their working interest is 25% each. Okay, and then question B is, does the well location determine the working interest? In other words, because the well is drilled on D's lease, does D have a higher working interest than the other working interest owners? And the answer is no. The working interest is determined by the contribution of leases, and it's as it's spelled out on Exhibit A of the joint operating agreement. So it doesn't matter where the well is located, they're still going to share their 1/4 interest because the contract area is all of section 1. The next question is, what is the amount of net royalty paid in the unit? And that is that D's mineral owner is going to get paid this royalty interest of 3/16 or a 0.1875. So what that means is, because it's just a 160-acre spacing unit instead of a 640-acre spacing unit, that means A, B, and C are not pooled in this well. That means they're not going to get any royalty payments. Only D is going to get a royalty payment because it's a 160-acre spaced unit. Even though A, B, and C are still in the joint operating agreement, because they weren't pooled with D, they are not going to get any royalty payment from the well that's drilled on D's lease. So A's royalty owner interest is going to be 0, B's is going to be 0, C's is going to be 0, and D is the only one that's going to get a royalty payment, and his royalty payment is going to be 3/16 or 0.1875. Now, here comes the tricky part. The royalty is borne by, and what is the working interest, and what is the net revenue interest of each? So that means who's going to pay the royalty and what is going to be their net revenue interest. Well, just like we did in 2A, what we're doing is, when we have a joint operating agreement, we're saying we're all going to agree to share the royalties up to a certain fraction. That is up to 1/8. So up to 1/8, we're all responsible for our share of that fraction. Anything over that is borne by the person who brought the excess royalty lease, what we call an excess royalty lease. So let's look at how this is going to work for the royalty interest who bears the royalty interest, and what is their net revenue interest. So even though A, B, and C are not going to get any royalty, the mineral owners, A, B, and C, are not going to get any royalty under the lease. A, B, and C, because they're getting a share of production, the lessees are getting a share of production, they're going to contribute to their share of the royalty payment up to this 25%. So what it's going to look like is they're going to say, we're going to take 25%, that's our working interest, and we're going to subtract from that our 25% working interest minus the 1/8. So what we're saying here is that, well, let me do it this way. I kind of like using fractions better, and that's what your book does. So we're going to say 25% minus 25%, 25% minus, we're responsible for 1/4, 25% of that royalty payment up to 1/8. So we're responsible for 25% or 1/4 of that 1/8. Remember, anytime you hear of, that means to multiply. 1/4 of 1/8. Okay? So that means our interest is going to be, let me just show you here. It's going to be 0.125. I'm sorry. 0.25 times 0.125. Let's just see what that is. 0.25 times a 0.125. So we're paying our 25, A is paying their 25% of this lease. So that means their interest is going to be at 0.03125. So now we're going to subtract that from 25%, or 0.25 minus 0.03125, and that's going to give us this 218,750. So that's A's interest, is this 218,750. 0.218,750. Now, if we look at B's interest is going to be exactly the same as A's, because B is also responsible for paying their 25%, or their 1/4, up to 1/8. So then we're going to deduct that from the 25% working interest that they own, and that's going to be what their net revenue interest is in the well. So that is also going to be a 218.218,750. Now let's look at C. C is in exactly the same position. Notice that we're not basing it on what their royalty interest is in their lease. We're only basing it on what they're responsible for under Article 3B, up to 1/8. So C's interest is going to be exactly the same. They're also responsible for 25% of that 1/8 royalty, deduct that from their working interest, and that's going to be their net revenue interest. But now let's look what happens to D. D's interest is going to be, let's do it over here, 25% minus 1/4 of 1/8, just like A, B, C, and D. But look, D's royalty is higher than 1/4. And when the lessee's royalty is on their land, in other words, that excess royalty is not shared, that's going to adversely impact D's net revenue interest. And so what it's going to look like is they're going to have to do 25% minus the 1/4 times 1/8 plus this additional 1/16 that makes it a 3/16 royalty. So now we're going to subtract 0.03125 here, 1/4 times 1/8, plus a 1/16, which is a 0.0625. And then we're going to subtract that from 25%. So that's going to be a 0.03125 plus the extra 1/16. That's going to be 0.09375. And we're going to subtract that from 25%. And that's going to make D's net revenue interest 0.15625. Okay, so you can see right away that they have a worse net revenue interest. Theirs is lower than both A, B, and C, and D. But if we want to look to the actual impact of it, we're going to use what's called this effective net revenue interest. And that is when you take the net revenue interest and you divide it by the working interest. So the formula is net revenue interest divided by the working interest. So if we did that with each of these, let's say we take 0.218750, 0.218, and we're going to divide that by their working interest, 0.25. Their working interest is going to be 0.875 or 87.5%. That's how much of each well they're going to get to keep as profits. They have to pay the amount over this, but what they get to keep, in their burdens, but what they get to keep is this 0.875% or 87.5% is what they get to keep out of every barrel of oil. So that's a pretty good return. We usually don't go lower than 75. I've actually never seen lower than 78. So that's a pretty good return that they're getting. So we'll put 0.875 is what their effective net revenue interest is. Equal 0.8750 or 87.5. And that's going to be the same for each of these guys. But look what happens when we get to D. D, we're going to take his net revenue interest, divide it by the working interest. And that's going to be this 0.15625. Bear with me. Golly, I'm doing this kind of late at night. I think that's the problem. 0.15625 divided by 0.25, their 25% working interest, equals 0.625. Now you remember in 2A, I think what they ended up with was the 37.5%, which is horrible. This is not as bad, 62.5% or 0.625 interest, but it's not as great as 87.5, and it's still way below the 75 minimum that we usually accept. So, D is in trouble here, but he's not in as much trouble as C was, but still 62.5 is a pretty low effective net revenue interest. So the whole point of these two exercises is to show you the impact if you are the person that, if the contract area is the same as the spacing unit, then each party is going to bear his own burdens. But if the party that has to bear a loan, in other words, they are the only interest owner in this spacing unit, it's going to adversely impact their net revenue interest. And so you need to take that into account when you're trying to figure out what number should we put in here. You usually want to put the highest burdens that there are. That's one good rule of thumb. But this can still work against you. So you just need to be careful when you decide what to put in that blank. I would recommend typically, well, I can't give advice, but usually you put your highest royalty payment in there. Or sometimes it even says we'll just share equally. So there's no risk of this happening where one person owns, which is whatever the royalties are, we'll just split it evenly. Some joint operating agreements just cross out this provision altogether because they don't know what kind of havoc it's going to wreak depending on where the well is placed. Okay, so that concludes this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you in the next problem.